Stringham, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about a lawyer's perspective on business. And we are also going to be joined by a manager from YPM, who's going to be talking about financials, financial statements, the real fun part of being an entrepreneur. She's got some great information as well as Stephen that I think you guys are really going to be able to take home with you a lot of really great points today. As always, we have a little bit of housekeeping that we're going to be talking about at the very beginning here. And then we're going to have a presentation by Stephen. We're going to take a break, and then Chandra's going to be with us from YPM as well. And then we're going to have a really brief conclusion. So last session, we talked about SWOT and really marketing strategies a little bit with Trent and Brian. So any takeaways from last week? Any questions about last week? I, for one, loved the SWOT presentation. I thought it was absolutely, probably one of the better ones so far. And Trent and Brian they like to talk and they know marketing, so they were a great presentation. Anything that you guys learned last week that you thought really stuck with you throughout the entire week? No, not particularly. I loved their conversation around knowing who your demographic is and really understanding that demographic and how to communicate to them, and knowing that not every marketing channel is what you need for your business. It may just be social media, it may be radio, it may be the Lethbridge Herald, but the really important thing is to know that demographic. And that is a lot easier said than done sometimes. But luckily we've talked quite a bit about that, and you guys have a little bit more time, so we don't have to worry too much about that. So I won't go into too much detail about our next couple speakers, other than to talk a little bit about what their qualifications are. You guys know that I like to typically let my speakers speak for themselves. And I feel that this is another week, I know I say this every week, that it's going to be another good week in terms of specialists that you're going to be talking to. With someone like Stephen or someone like Chandra who comes in and talks to you guys about business, the opportunity to sit across from someone like that and have as close to a one-on-one conversation as this can be with them is something that can be really beneficial, especially when you're at this startup phase, okay? So the competition, this is your mantra. I swear you guys are gonna get a tattoo. April 21st at what time? Everybody say it. 2 o'clock p.m. If I get your business plan at 2:01, not gonna be able to accept it for the competition. If you're worried about that, do a test run with us first so that we make sure that it's all going to be uploaded, okay? So the first speaker that we're going to be joined with today is Stephen Mogden, who, as I mentioned, is a lawyer with Stringham & Nash. He's a partner with Stringham. He started his articling with the firm back in 2001, 2002, after he graduated from law school, and he's been with them ever since. Stringham is someone that actually, Community Futures, we work quite a bit with them, and a big reason of why we do that is because of their legal expertise. And that's why I'm so excited to have Stephen in. So his practices are mainly in the areas of business law, real estate law, wills and estates, and he's also been a litigator, including in family law. So he has a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. And on top of that, I'm really excited because Stephen actually, last year, I believe, it was 2014, 2015, he was the president of the Chamber of Commerce, which I don't know how much you guys know about the Chamber of Commerce in Lethbridge, but we have a really active and a really good chamber in Lethbridge that puts together a lot of great programs for small business owners. And Stephen was the president of the chamber for, he's the current, the last outgoing president of the chamber. And on top of that, he also is involved with the downtown Lethbridge revitalization zone. The business revitalization zone is an area of downtown Lethbridge. Have any of you lived here for a long time? Yeah, more than 5-10 years. Have you guys noticed that the downtown core itself has gotten a whole lot nicer in terms of what the buildings look like, the businesses that are going in there? That's what the BRZ does, the Business Revitalization Zone does, and Stephen's heavily involved with that as well. So I won't go into too much more detail other than what I have, and I'll ask for a big round of applause for Stephen.
So I'm competing with last week, hey?
I know, right?
There you go, great, thank you. Not a problem.
Definitely.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks very much, Jason, for the kind intro. Just
by way of correction, I'm not still involved with the BRZ. I was previously, spent 3 years on the board there, but have, it was a 3-year term, and that's done now. That's kind of my background there. So I've been involved with the Chinook Entrepreneur Challenge for, I think, going on 5 years now. And it's really been a great program. Really love coming and presenting to all of you as you're on the start of that journey where you're looking at putting some entrepreneur ideas into practice and getting a business going. So I come at it from a legal perspective. Should probably start my presentation here. And so I called this, I actually did this last year and kind of brushed up on it a little bit for this year, but not too many changes. So I called it, so you've got a great business idea, what do you do now? And that's kind of what you guys are involved in, is transferring that idea into sort of the reality. So it's my hope, kind of two hopes tonight. The first is that I'll be able to give you some useful information, steer you in some interesting directions, and answer any questions that you may have. And my second hope is that I don't end up in a fit of coughing tonight, because I've been suffering from the worst cold I've been dealing with I haven't had a cold like this in years, and it's been really bad. So I've got my Fisherman's Friends, I've got my water. Hopefully I'll be all right. So we'll go ahead. So this is some information on the legal aspects of starting a business. So in terms of an agenda, brief introduction. Jason's already provided a lot of the introductory remarks there. And then we'll talk a little bit about business vehicles and the different things that you need to look at with that. Talk about naming your business. And then I want to give you some words about advisors and business partners, and some thoughts about protecting your business. It says conclusion questions. I do welcome questions throughout. So if you have a question, don't feel like you have to save it to the end. I'd be happy to field questions as we go. Chances are, if you have a question, it's something that someone else is thinking of as well, and so we can take care of those as we go, I think. So yeah, introduction. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Again, Jason's done a lot of that stuff. So all of those little bullet points, those aren't supposed to be my head. That's really weird. They're supposed to be little arrows. So, anyway.
Wow.
I'm not that vain. I don't know how that happened. Okay, so as Jason said, yeah, I've been practicing since 2002, all at Stringham. Used to be Stringham Denneke. We recently had a merger, so we're now Stringham LLP. And the areas where I really focus on is business law, real estate, and wills and estates. I do some civil litigation, mostly connected with business clients, sometimes with real estate, sometimes with estate matters. But that's kind of the extent of it. I used to do more family law litigation, that sort of thing. So I have that in my background. So we'll just kind of proceed on. So in terms of business vehicles, that's you need to look at having a business vehicle that you're going to move forward with. And people often kind of know about business vehicles in a general sense, but there's a lot of specifics that they maybe don't know, and some things that they should think about as they're looking at what sort of business vehicle they're going to use for their business idea. So we're going to talk about sole proprietorship first, and then we're going to talk about corporation. We'll talk about partnership. I don't really talk about joint ventures because it's not a vehicle per se. It's more a tax thing, really. But it's something that you can look at going down the road. So we'll look at these and we'll talk about what they are, what they do, why you might want to prefer one of those over another one of them, what are their advantages and disadvantages and that sort of thing. When we're going through that, and as you're looking at what sort of business vehicle you might be best to go with, you want to think about certain things. You want to think about liability issues. How likely is it that you might have to worry about liability with the business that you're doing? Some businesses will have a greater degree of potential liability than others. Control and succession, right? Succession is not something that you may really be thinking a whole bunch about as you're in the process of getting your business up and running, but it's something that you'll want to keep an eye on for eventually down the road. How do you go about bringing other people in, or you yourself exiting and transferring that over to someone? You'll want to think about flexibility that you might require through your business vehicle, because some of them have a greater degree of flexibility than others. And of course, you want to think about the tax angle, and that's something that John will talk a lot more about than I will. As lawyers, we like to leave the tax component really to the accountants rather than getting in trouble with that stuff ourselves. So in terms of sole proprietorship, that's really a business vehicle which is essentially yourself doing business personally. So you would do business in your own name or under perhaps a trade name, and you'd be the person that owns the assets of the business and carries on all the operations and that sort of thing. Oh man, that's so weird with my head. So there's some advantages to doing a sole proprietorship. Control is fairly simple. I mean, if you're in a sole proprietorship, you're pretty much the person that's calling the shots. You don't typically have to worry too much about what other people might say or might advise. Maybe spouses accepted out of that, but and that generally speaking won't change too much unless you look at changing the type of vehicle that you're using. Typically, a sole proprietorship isn't really costly to set up and isn't too complex to set up. It does kind of depend a little bit on various aspects of what you want to do with your sole proprietorship. So you might want to look at some name protection issues for your business name. I'll get into talking about a business name a few slides down the road, but it's something that you'll want to look at as you go forward with the sole proprietorship. And that can bring in some additional complexity and maybe some additional cost. Depending on the type of business that you're doing, you may need to look at working up a contract for services, that sort of thing. And if that's the case, that you might be spending a little bit of money to make sure that you have something in place that's going to protect you as you deal with clients and customers and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, for a sole proprietorship, cost is usually less of a concern than with some of the other business vehicles. For a sole proprietorship, usually they require a little less ongoing management than some of the other business vehicles. I mean, you'll need to be doing your books and doing your taxes and that sort of thing. But aside from that, usually the ongoing management of a sole proprietorship isn't terribly onerous. Excuse me. In terms of disadvantages, sole proprietorship can sometimes be a little bit inflexible when it comes to things like deductions for taxes and that type of thing. That's something that you'll want to talk to your financial advisor, your accountant about. Succession with a sole proprietorship can be a little bit difficult, sometimes be a little bit clumsy. If you want to bring someone in, you may end up looking at transferring into a different type of business vehicle. And you may simply look at transferring that business to that person that you're bringing in. And then with the sole proprietorship, sometimes those are a little bit less easy to arrange financing than with some of the other business vehicles. When we look at a corporation, we can look at raising capital through issuing shares in the corporation, that sort of thing. That you don't really have the ability to do with your sole proprietorship. But those are some of the disadvantages. Any questions at this point? Anybody have anything that's striking? If not, I'll keep going. So, second business vehicle that I want to talk about tonight is, of course, the corporation, and that's one of the business vehicles that a lot of people sort of think of as the go-to business vehicle. So a corporation is a business vehicle in which one or more persons create an artificial person, the corporation, and then they carry on business through that corporation. In law, the corporation is a person itself, so it does have a distinct legal entity from the people that own the corporation, the shareholders, and it's a different distinct legal entity from the people that direct the corporation, which are the directors. And it can be a really interesting business vehicle with in terms of flexibility and that sort of thing. So talking about advantages, as I said, it's a distinct legal entity. That can provide you with some protection from liability. So if you're operating through a corporation and if you're doing things right, if there's a liability issue, somebody wants to sue your business that you're operating through a corporation, they can sue the corporation, but for the most part, they wouldn't be able to sue you as the person behind the corporation or the owner of the corporation. So there could be some protection from liability in that circumstance. That may make more sense for some people than for other people. I talked a little bit a few moments ago about having flexibility in terms of financing business operations. And so with a corporation, you can raise capital through issuing shares to people. There's some rules around that, so I mean, you don't want to go sort of hog wild on that without getting some advice on how you go about doing that. But it is a possibility that you have with a corporation. Because the corporation is a separate legal entity, you have some succession possibilities that are a little bit more flexible than you have with a sole proprietorship or often with a partnership. So if you hold shares in a corporation, you can will those shares to someone else. So if you die, they transfer over to someone else, depending on how the corporation is set up. Excuse me. And with a corporation, you can take advantage of some tax savings. Again, I won't get into sort of nitty-gritty on that because that's something that I'm sure Chandra will talk about when she comes in a little bit later. In terms of disadvantages, corporation can be, well, typically it is a little more complex and costly to set up. A corporation essentially gets set up by filing certain documents with a registrar of corporations. Here in Alberta, ours is the Alberta Registrar of Corporations. And so you file articles of incorporation, and that gets the company started, and then you put in place some governance documents, some management documents for the corporation. Typically, people will get a professional to help them with that. Usually a lawyer, sometimes an accounting office will get into that territory as well. So when you do that, you may incur some more cost. We really like to, from a legal perspective, though, help people with that because we find that when people do that themselves, they tend to, or they can anyway, get into a situation where they're not doing things right or not paying attention to the stuff that they need to do. We'll have people that will call into the office and say, you know, I set up my corporation through, you know, the motor vehicle registry office, and here's what I want to do. And then you ask them, well, do you have your minute book? And they'll say, what's a minute book? And that can be a bit of a problem, right? So there's stuff that you need to take care of when you're setting up a corporation, and to do that right, a little bit of complexity involved and sometimes some cost, but well worth the initial investment. Where we have to go back and fix those mistakes. For example, if we have to do articles to amend the original articles, that tends to be a little bit of a costly endeavor. So, got a question right here.
Yeah. So when setting up a corporation, do shares have to be produced, or is there corporations where there's no shares needed, like if it's a nonprofit, or do you have to have shares? Like I know there's common shares and there's all different types, but can you just set up a corporation with no shares?
You can. There's not really a good reason to do it. Somebody wants to be a shareholder at some point. There is, it will happen sometimes where people set it up and then they don't issue shares, but that's going to have to get caught up at some point. I won't go into sort of not-for-profit territory because there's different types of not-for-profits, and some of them are structured differently with members and how they deal with classes of members and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, if you're going to use a corporation, you're going to want to issue shares to someone.
Thank you.
I mean, if you don't issue shares, ultimately, you don't have somebody that is electing directors and putting somebody in place to make those decisions for the corporation moving forward. So.
Yeah, we got a question from online and talking, I believe, about the liability of a corporation, and they said, what are the circumstances that you, as the business owner, could be liable with a corporation?
So kind of two main ones where you'd be able to attach liability to somebody that's behind the corporation. If you do business through a corporation, but you don't make it apparent that you're doing that. So for example, if you're entering into contracts, but you're not making it apparent, you're not making it very visible that you're doing this on behalf of, like through the corporation, then if there's an issue with that contract, if somebody wants to sue on that contract, you may be prevented from saying, well, it was really with a corporation, so you can't sue me, you have to sue the corporation. So if somebody can legitimately say, well, I didn't really understand, I really didn't know that that you were doing this through a corporation, then you can potentially attach liability to a shareholder. That's one way of doing it. Sometimes people will, unfortunately, use corporations as a bit of a front, as a bit of a sham. And so there is the possibility of, if somebody's really doing that in bad faith, people can make an application to the court to sort of go behind that corporate veil, or pierce the corporate veil, as the lawyers like to say. So that can happen. Those are kind of two of the main circumstances that I can think of.
In my own work, I've heard of people that say they don't pay their staff and they go out of business, they go bankrupt. In that instance, if you have payroll, that can CRA go after the business owner for that payroll if the corporation doesn't have the assets?
I mean, directors are liable for statutory remittances and that sort of thing. So yeah, you won't be able to hide behind the corporation in that circumstance.
Okay. So we've got another question from online here. So if you're registered a 50-50 owner in a business for a corporation, how easy or how hard is it to change that ownership structure in terms of what the percentage is?
Well, it's really easy if both, if the 50-50 people agree on it. If not, then essentially you have a stalemate, and in theory, it's very difficult to make decisions and change that structure. Actually dealt with a scenario like that a few years ago on a litigation basis, where essentially two brothers were, their spouses were involved as well, but it was mainly the two brothers that were involved in the corporation, and they were kind of at different spots in their life, and one of them really wanted to retire and not be as active in the business anymore. He wanted to work sort of 2 days a week kind of thing, and the other one wasn't. He was much more, 6 days a week kind of thing. And that got them into disagreements. And they were exactly 50-50, and they had no way to sort of break that tie. So in that circumstance, that can lead to some kind of nasty litigation sometimes. That leads me to an issue about dealing with the complexity and cost to set up a corporation. If you're getting into a corporate structure where there's basically two people and they're equal in the corporation in terms of their shareholding, you very well might want to have something called a unanimous shareholders agreement. And that's an agreement that the lawyers will prepare. And it essentially regulates the relationship between the shareholders. One of the things that it does is it usually provides a mechanism to get past that sort of impasse in making decisions in the corporation. Often they'll do it by way of something like a shotgun clause where somebody makes an offer to buy another person. And the upshot of that is that eventually someone will be out, right? And then someone can make those decisions going forward. Those tend to be a little bit of an added expense, but if you're in that situation where you're getting into a corporate structure with another person and you want to be equal moving forward, it's a great situation, and you go into that with the best of intentions, kind of like a marriage. You go into it with the best of intentions, but you don't always see things eye to eye as you go down the road. So it's really good to have that unanimous shareholders agreement, even though it can be a little bit of an expense up front. Any other questions, Ray? I think you.
Can your kids be shareholder, and how old can they be?
They can be. It's not a good idea, though,
Mm.
generally speaking, for minors. And in some situations, people will issue shares to minor shareholders in professional corporations and that sort of thing. And there's some special rules about it, but I think you get into some kiddie tax issues and that sort of thing as well. So, in my view, not the best scenario usually.
So along the same lines, if you have older kids who are growing up and they want to be shareholders, so let's say you make them shareholders, well, and then they get married. So is their spouse now automatically, or is that, so maybe this goes to your marital law section of the program. I don't know.
Well, I mean, undoubtedly there will be a marital law aspect to that, but that's one of the reasons that you will typically want to have a unanimous shareholders agreement, because that will deal with various contingencies. Aside from sort of having a decision-making impasse between shareholders, you want to have that in place for things like, what if one of your shareholders loses capacity? They suffer dementia or something like that. They can't make decisions for themselves and about their business interests.
That's our end of it, actually, not the kids.
So, but yeah, and as far as kids go, yeah, if you bring it, you bring your son into the business, and he's an adult and he's married, you may not be contemplating being in business with his spouse if they should happen to get divorced. So usually the unanimous shareholders agreement will provide for that and allow for the corporation to basically retract those or repurchase those shares if it's a situation where a court is saying, hey, we're going to take the son's shares, we're going to give them to the wife, right? So especially if you're, the more people that you have in your corporation, and especially if they have spouses and that sort of thing, you really want to look at having that unanimous shareholders agreement in place. Okay, so move on, I think. So partnership is another business vehicle that you can look at. So that's a vehicle in which two or more people carry on business in common with a view to a profit. Partnerships are more common in certain fields than they are maybe in other fields. It's very common, for example, in the legal field or in the accounting field to be involved in a partnership. Stringham LLP is a limited liability partnership. So we carry on business through our partnership. They can be relatively easy to form, not in all circumstances, but they can be. The law can deem you to be in a partnership if you are operating a business in common with someone and you have a view to a profit. So in that scenario, you may be in a partnership already and you don't really know it. Typically, we prefer to see partnerships created by agreement so that there's a document that sets out the rights of each of the partners vis-a-vis each other and kind of what their contributions are to the partnership and that sort of thing. Partnerships can be fairly flexible when it comes to financing business operations. So usually you'll have your partners contributing something in terms of capital to the business. And then you can use that capital for growing the business. I find, partnerships tend to have more resources in terms of just sort of talent and that sort of thing than a sole proprietorship or a sole one-person corporation. And that can be a real benefit to people moving forward as they're trying to grow their business. In terms of disadvantages, a partnership isn't a distinct legal entity, so partners will be personally liable for stuff that happens with the partnership if there's liability attaching to that. There's some exceptions to that. That's where people get into limited liability partnerships and that type of thing. But generally speaking, yeah, partners will be personally liable for debts of the partnership. It's a really good reason to make sure that you really trust the people you get into a partnership with. In terms of tax treatment, partnerships are not, generally speaking, as favorably treated as your corporate structure. But that may depend on what, how you're going about setting that up. Accountant could probably speak to that a little bit better than I would. No real limit on how many partners you can have in a business. So that's a nice feature of it. You can bring in more partners as you move along. So name stuff. So your business name. That's what identifies you, of course, to the outside world. Usually says something about what you do, who you are, what sort of services you offer, or products, and that sort of thing. Your business name may have some specific requirements and really needs to be unique. Depending on your business vehicle, you'll look at some different aspects of naming your business. If you're a sole proprietorship or a partnership, you're supposed to file a declaration under the Partnership Act within a certain period of time of starting to use a business name. For a corporation, you'll essentially have a number for your corporation, or you'll pick a name to that corporation. If you don't want to have a name, you'll get kind of the next number that comes out of the queue, so to speak, from the corporate registry. So I just put an example up there. I think we're into 7 digits now in Alberta in terms of our numbers of corporations. I think Ontario's into 8 digits now. In terms of your corporate name, you'll want to have a unique element to that, a descriptive element and a legal element as well. So in the example that I put up there for Mercury Plumbing, your unique element is the Mercury part. Plumbing is your descriptive element, and then your legal element is LTD or Corp. No real difference between those. They mean the same thing, basically. But you'll need to have one of those. And then there's going to be some requirements in the Business Corporations Act and its regulation regarding names. If you have some doubts, or if you want your name to be kind of funky or something like that, you'll want to get some advice. There's a limit, for example, on how long your name can be. I think that limit is 200 characters, though. So if it fits within a tweet, I think. And there's some prohibited stuff as well. I mean, you can't bring in stuff that would suggest a government affiliation if you're not affiliated with government and that sort of thing. And some stuff about names that might be offensive and that sort of thing. So when you're looking at your business name, you want to make sure that that you're observing those requirements. You'll also want to make sure that your business name isn't going to infringe on someone else's business name. So what we'll do is we'll do a search that provides us with a list of names that are similar to the name that you've picked. So it runs kind of an algorithm to put together names that bring in elements of what your name looks like. And what we're looking for when we get that list is names that may be too close to your name that might cause confusion in the marketplace or with sort of the general public. Because if that's the case, then you may have to suffer some consequences, right? So if you don't sort of get the name right that way, you may have to change your business name or discontinue using it, which isn't a great situation when you've spent some time and potentially some money and that sort of thing in putting a business name together and then putting that out in front of the public. And then, as I talked about before in response to that question that came in over the online, if you fail to set out your corporate name correctly when you're dealing with other people, that can lead to a loss of liability protection in the corporate vehicle.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
The name, you said you had to declare it with the Partnership Act within 6 months. Is that the same as registering your business name?
Yeah, so essentially it's registering a trade name.
Okay. And then the other thing is, do you have to register your trade name in different provinces, or do you just do it once for?
If you're going to be doing business in different provinces, you may want to, depending on what your business vehicle is. So, for example, if you're a corporation, but you're operating, you're a number corporation, but you're operating with a trade name. If you're going to be doing business in another province, you'll need to make sure that you're registering extra-provincially into that province. Like if your home jurisdiction is Alberta and you want to do business in BC, you'll need to make sure that you're extra-provincially registered in BC. And then each province will likely have different requirements for that. I would expect that in almost all of those, you'd be looking at doing a registration with the similar scenario as here in that jurisdiction.
So if you're doing like online sales, for example, so online sales could be national, so would I have to register my business name in each province then, or would I?
Likely not, because if you're doing online sales from Alberta, theoretically your contract is likely being formed in Alberta, and you're shipping stuff elsewhere.
Okay.
Right. So really, what's happening legally is happening in Alberta.
Okay.
So you probably don't need to look at.
Whereas if I was consulting and going to BC to do consulting work, then I should probably register in BC.
Yeah, absolutely.
Understood. Thank you.
So is there a difference between federally incorporated and just incorporated?
There is. All of the provinces have a Provincial Corporations Act. Ours it's called the Business Corporations Act. There is a federal Canadian Business Corporations Act. They're very similar in almost all respects. Our Corporations Act really mirrors the federal act. If you're looking at doing businesses in a bunch of different jurisdictions, it may make sense to register under the federal statute rather than registering under a provincial statute and then extra provincially registering in every jurisdiction that you're going to do business.
One of the questions online was, how would you deal with registration internationally? If your business name was doing business
That's a good
outside?
question. I don't do a whole lot of international stuff. I would expect that if you're going to register internationally, you'll want to have some advice from the jurisdiction that you're going to be in, whether it's in the States or somewhere in Europe or something like that. Yeah. I'm going to have to duck that question.
That's the same thing I would say. Find a specialist in that area and ask them.
Any questions right at the moment? All right, so one of the things that, having gone through 5 weeks now of the program here at the Chinook Entrepreneur Challenge, is you've probably heard a lot about making sure that you have advisors in place and having business partners in place. So what we see from our perspective doing the legal side of it is that successful entrepreneurs really know that they need to have a good team in place, and that's really essential to their business. For us, if we have a client that is going to be doing some stuff that is going to have a definite tax impact to it, that's where we want to bring in the accountant and get advice on that. If they're getting into a situation where their intellectual property might need a really good hard look, we may need to refer them to a firm that specializes in that type of thing. So it's really good to have those team members in place, and that's really part of what this process that you're going through teaches you. So consider carefully whether or probably when you need to have good advice on various things: business law, business coaching, taxes, bookkeeping advice, that sort of thing. And depending on what you are going to be doing with your business, you might need different advice at different times. For example, if you're going to start up a business and you're going to find some space, you're going to have a storefront and that sort of thing, you may need to have some advice on leasing issues and that sort of thing. You're being presented with a lease agreement by the landlord of this space. You should probably know what is in that lease agreement and how it impacts you and how it may impact your business. And that's the type of thing that that's timely advice, and so you need to know who to go to for that type of thing. I mean, these can be a business expense, but they can save you time and money down the road. That's really the intention of it. Help you avoid mistakes and help you save time and money by avoiding mistakes down the road. And really, one of the things that I think people tend to overlook is it should help you grow your business faster. If you have people looking at sort of the technical aspects, if you have a lawyer dealing with your business law aspects and an accountant dealing with your accounting side, the numbers, somebody is looking at the marketing aspects for you because you're not a marketing whiz, it lets you concentrate on what you should be doing, whether that's building your contacts, developing your products, developing your markets, all that type of thing. Free yourself from the stuff that you don't need to do and that you can have other people do with you and for you. In terms of protecting your business, I always find it's useful to give a few words on intellectual property. So your best case scenario is your business offers a product or a service that has attracted imitators because it's good, right? And that's the reason that you do it. Your worst case is that you have people that want to imitate it, and you've forgotten to put in place some protection for that business, for your intellectual property, your name, your know-how, that sort of thing. So we always want to make sure that you're taking appropriate steps to protect what you're working to build up. And so in that respect, we'd really love to speak with you if you have those concerns. And we want to make sure that you're not setting up your business in a way that is going to get you into trouble, that's maybe going to have it set up so that it looks a lot like a business that's out there already, and trying to sort of trade off of that similarity. That may get you into a litigation situation where somebody is saying, hey, you can't do what you're doing because it really infringes on what I've already built up. So when you're going about setting up your business and growing it, you want to make sure that you're not going to get into trouble that way. As well, on the notion of protecting your business, it can be kind of a complex world out there. So part of what we do with respect to our clients is make sure that you are compliant with or at least made aware of legislation that affects you and affects your business. And I've listed some of them there, certainly not a closed list. Depending on what you do, you may need to look at legislation that governs food safety issues, for example. You may need to look at legislation that deals with alcohol issues, gaming issues, that sort of thing, right? Employment standards will often come into it if you have employees and that sort of thing. There's privacy laws about anti-spamming, all of that kind of stuff. So these can be really important to your business as it grows. And so you need to make sure that you know how these affect you and affect your operations. So that's actually the end of my presentation. So anybody have any other questions at the moment?
What is the average cost for setting up a corporation, like with a law firm? If we were to come to you and I say I'm a small business, how much would it cost? What's the fees going to be?
If you're not putting in place a unanimous shareholders agreement, you should be looking at, you know, somewhere between $800 and $1,000. And that should cover everything, your GST and the registry charges, like $250
Yeah, and
to
then the
register.
unanimous shareholders agreement, does that just get, basically the more complex it is, the more it's
As
gonna
with
cost as
most
it-
things.
Yeah, yeah.
As with most things, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we can do a fairly sort of cookie cutter unanimous shareholders agreement, and that'll apply to a lot of businesses. It doesn't really need to be really complex, but depending on your scenario, the more people you have that are involved, if they're involved in sort of different degrees. So if you have a major person, a 70% owner and a couple of 15% owners, that may require a little bit different treatment through your unanimous shareholders agreement. So in that scenario, yeah, your costs will go up a little bit, but I mean, typically a unanimous shareholders agreement, if it's not really complicated, maybe $1,000 or $1,500.
Also, at what time are you protected by the liability of the corporation? It's not obviously like you file it with you today, you're going to be protected tomorrow kind of thing?
Well, I
Is
mean,
it
as
that
soon
fast?
as soon as you register your articles of incorporation with the registry, once that corporation is incorporated, it is the legal entity.
Yeah,
So
how long does the registration process usually take?
It's really quick.
It's
actually,
quick.
yeah. If you contacted me in the morning, we can have it set up by the afternoon.
Do you have any ballpark figures for one, patentability search for your products, two, the full cost of registering a patent in Canada, and three, any figures abroad?
As well for patents?
Yeah.
So no, and no. So we really don't deal with patents very much. Really, really specialized area of law. People that do patents, that's kind of like all they do, generally speaking. So yeah, I couldn't even really venture to guess what sort of cost you're looking at for that.
How hard would it be to do the unanimous shareholders agreement sometime in the future? Like, if you're starting your corporation out small, like a husband-wife deal, but you expect in the future to grow and issue new shares to generate capital and stuff like that, is it better to do it right off the bat, or can you implement it in a future time, I guess?
Yes, it's better to do it right off the bat. Yes, you can do it at a future time, but if you do it at a future time, everybody has to agree to do it, right? So if there's at all a question about that, we like it to be done at the same time as we're doing up the corporation and issuing shares, so that all that stuff gets signed at the same time. Because, I mean, once people have the shares issued to them, there's nothing that can sort of compel them to enter into that unanimous shareholders agreement. Theoretically, I mean, if it's a husband-wife corporation, they shouldn't have too much of an issue putting that in place down the road. So, I mean, people will do that. They'll do it for cost reasons and that sort of thing. You're just starting out. If you can defray that, delay that cost for a little bit, why not, right? If there's an issue about whether you will be able to put that into place later on, then make sure that you're doing it kind of right away. Great question.
We got one from online here. So is it possible to have partners who are not residents or citizens of Canada if they're living in the States and living in Europe?
In terms of a partnership, yes. I don't know if that question is directed at people involved in a corporation. So I'll maybe sort of throw that into my answer as well. Because people will often talk about being partners in a business when really what they mean is they're a 50% shareholder and the other person's a 50% shareholder. So in that scenario, in terms of corporate law in Canada, you have to have, there's some requirements for having a certain number of Canadian, a certain proportion of Canadian directors and that sort of thing. So yeah, if there's an issue of having people that are resident elsewhere, out of the country, then it's usually a good idea to contact someone and get into sort of the specifics of that for some advice.
I have one question that I'm interested in. You talked a lot about succession planning and for the different business vehicles. And I know we're at the very beginning of the process here in terms of the business plan, but how important is that succession planning? And also, when should a small business owner think about putting some sort of succession plan on the books so that it is kind of in the system and they know what they want to do?
We like to say as early as possible, because one of the things that we see is people never put a thought to that, and then they go down the road and they build up their business and they work at that, building up that business for decades, and then they get down the road and it's very difficult to disengage and to put in that succession plan at that point. So the earlier that you can think about it, the better. That being said, you can always kind of add it in later on. Depending on how you want to bring someone in or you yourself exit out of the business, the earlier you've thought about that and the earlier you've gotten advice on that, the easier it may be to do. I mean, we've had situations where people have wanted to sell assets of a corporation and get out and that sort of thing. And in order to do that, we've had to work closely with the accountants to make sure that there's some cleanup involved and that sort of thing. So it's good to think about that as early as possible. Not crucial to put it in place, but I certainly like to see it and can talk about that with you.
All right, big thank you to Stephen. That was absolutely fantastic. Lot of points that I really liked in his presentation that I would really hammer home to you guys. One is the partnerships. I think this is the second or third presenter that we've talked to that has said that whoever you go into business with, it is like a marriage. And that is so true. You need to know who you're going into business with and what their goals for that business are. I've had clients that have come in and owner A has a goal that they want to build this business up over the next 10, 15 years and eventually sell it off. Partner B wants to get it to the point where he can start taking cash out. And he treated the business like his own personal ATM. And at that point, because they didn't necessarily have an agreement in place and didn't talk to the lawyers, getting out of a situation like that, it's just like a marriage. If it's bad, it's really bad. And I have seen so many businesses destroyed by something like that. So that was one that I really liked. And I didn't even tell him to surround yourself with specialists. I didn't even tell him that I've been trying to drill that home to you guys because it is so critically important. You cannot be everything to your business. So if you need advice, go and find it from someone like Stephen, from someone like myself, from someone like Chandra, who's going to be joining us after the break here, because that's what they are there for, okay? So we're going to take a really quick break here. Why don't we come back for 22, so it's going to be about 15 minutes or so, and we'll get started with the second half of our presentation.